We have talked last time about the situation in Mythic Plus. So far it was September the 19th. Now it is September the 26th. It has been a full week, a full reset in between the last video to now, and we get to update what has been going down in Mythic Plus. Our last bullet points last week were the growth of Resto Druid over Resto Shaman, the growth of Prot Warrior over Prot Paladin, as well as the post buffs growth of Beast Mastery in the Mythic Plus popularity at high key level. So now, 1 week later, we get to see, first of all, if any of these trends continued and if there are any new ones. Now, as for our original trends, the answer is yes to the first one. Beast Mastery Hunter has continued its popularity growth. Last week in Mythic Stats, they ended their popularity in high key levels at 13.4%. Now they went up to 26.9%, a very massive increase in popularity, the largest jump from 1 week to the next actually of any spec this season. They are now not contesting Havoc, Arcane and Frost Decay, of course, but they have put themselves as the second highest, the next best thing after those three. When you change sites and you look at Raider.io popularity of the top specs when it comes to 16 and higher, yes, now you do see Beast Mastery Hunter as the fourth best spec. For more dramatic effect, this was the popularity a couple of weeks ago, and then last reset where BM comfortably passed every other spec, and even this reset, yes, obviously it's just a couple of days, it's not that relevant, but even in a couple of days you see BM, if anything, getting even closer to the top three rather than being with the second bracket of good specs, Fury, Elemental, Ret, Destruction, Balance, Sub-Rogue. So there is a definite growth for BM over there. You also see it in WoW Meta, where BM made it into the A tier, now getting very close into being considered an S tier spec, as well as growing a lot in Archon and making it into the A tier in terms of average score, while also at the moment being the second spec in terms of popularity at high keys. So it is definitely confirmed, this surge of popularity of BM Hunter for this reset as well, because they could have stopped, they could have abruptly stopped last week, figured out that their ceiling was 18s or 19 level keys and not grown anymore, but instead they did continue their growth quite nicely. Now, if you're asking a certain things, for example, after the trio at the top, which is Frost, Arcane and Havoc, and after this growth of BM Hunter, okay, fine. There are a few specs that have been high up, although not nearly as relevant nowadays. You see that in this pack at the top, the second bracket of good specs, you keep seeing Sub, Balance, Marksmanship, Destro, Elemental, Ret and Fury. This is the clump of specs, maybe even Feral Druid in this clump of specs. Now the situation does change when, instead of looking at each of the specs by their popularity, you look at how many of them are at each key level, because all of these graphs start counting the popularity of the specs from 16 level keys. But you see, for example, that Red Paladin starts out at 4.8% in 16 keys when it comes to popularity, but at plus 20 keys it's 0.5%. Even at 19 it's 1.4%, which is a significant drop from their popularity in 16s. For example, Balanced Druid starts at 2.8, ends at 2.5. You have Elemental, which starts at 3.7, ends at 7.7. The two hunters combined start at 9.5 and they finish at 12.6. The other spec that falls quite a lot is Warlock. Between Demo and Destro they make up 5.5% of the picks in 16 keys, and then they make up 2% in 20 level keys. So there are specs that will show up as being popular similar to others like Ret and Destro, but only at 16. Basically at 16-ish level is where their popularity lies. Once you start getting into 17, 18, 19, that is where these two specs in particular, Ret and Destro, are not staying, I mean, they're not keeping up nearly as well to other specs like Elemental or like Balanced Druid or like either of the Hunter specs being played at the moment. It is more visible in some of these other graphs, like the one from WoW Meta, where you do see Ret and Destro, for example, being quite lower down in the overall meta of specs. This is more fitting their current popularity as you go higher up in keys. Not to say they are terrible or not to say they're bad, of course, it's just that if you look at the consistency of these specs being present is in those high level keys at the moment, Elemental, Subtlety, Balance, BM, Fury, Marksmanship, even Feral have gotten there more consistently than these two specs. The same will go for group composition. You will still see Ret being present in 2 of the more popular groups, or Destro even being present in 1, 2, 3, 4 of the more popular groups, but that's starting from 16 and up. As you go higher in level, you will have less and less relevance of these two specs over the others, even down to, at this very moment, again, it's only a few days. We're only a few days into this reset, but you see technically BM is part of the more popular group in keys, replacing Arcane Mage at this very moment. Now, the other trend we were observing last week was the fact that Prot Warrior was gaining more on Prot Paladin, to the point where there was a reasonable gap now between the two, at the very least towards the higher level of keys. You can see right now the top level keys being done from Raider.io. You see that a pretty significant chunk, at the very least towards the majority of the tanks in here, are Protection Warriors. And we have the graph explaining this quite nicely when it comes to tank as well. You do see that Prot Warrior has almost matched Protection Paladin. However, this doesn't seem nearly as the same as what we just saw from Mythic Stats, which is telling us that Prot Warrior is like 30% higher than Prot Paladin. That's because, again, you have to look at each individual key level. Once you do look at each individual key level, the higher you go, the more Prot Warrior gains. At the moment, even in 20s, they are at 71% compared to the 20% of Prot Paladin. Yes, technically at the moment 21s are not taken that seriously, since there is a grand total of 6 tanks available in 21 level keys. But this is a nice image, perfectly encapsulating the popularity of Prot Warrior over the past over a month, since this is for the entire season really, as the higher you go in keys, with Prot Warrior essentially doubling its play rate. They start at 35% in 16 keys and they end at 71% in 20 keys, which is slightly over twice as much. And again, it will be visible here when you start looking at the most popular comps. This is still only tracking 16 level keys and up, so you do still see Prot Paladin putting up a pretty even match to Prot Warrior. But as you will keep going higher in keys, 17, 18 and 19s, there will be a progressive presence of Prot Warriors over Prot Paladins. A lot of it, in case you're curious, a lot of it has simply to do with tankiness. It's not really necessarily having to do with answers like, oh, it's because eventually Prot Warrior just does way more damage than Protection Paladin, which is true. It is true, but it's not to that absurd amount where Prot is the super clear top DPS spec that is gapping Prot Paladin by like 2 million DPS. Prot Paladin is reasonably close to the DPS Prot Warrior is doing. Prot Warrior is stronger, but just not to that extent. It's just more normally the tankiness. How more likely is Prot Warrior to stay alive over Prot Paladin? That's really all it is. And this is a pretty big tell, because remember that at the moment in our keys, our meta comp is Arcane, Havoc and Frost DK. And Prot Paladin does bring Devotion Aura, which is a 3% damage reduction for your whole party, whereas Prot Warrior brings Battle Shout, which is effectively useless, more or less, to your healer and to your mage. So the group is even willing to lose some default tankiness brought by the Prot Paladin in order to gain some suboptimal damage buff of the Prot Warrior, just because of how more resistant Prot Warrior is to the Mythic Plus damage taken. Prot Warrior definitely is a great help in the most dicey of situation thanks to Rallying Cry. It's a pretty nice cooldown to have, but to be fair, Prot Paladin can juggle and cycle things like Sacrifice, things like Blessing of Protection or Blessing of Spell Warding, even things like Lay on Hand, so they do also have their own very good utility tools for the party. They definitely have more utility tools for the party than Prot Warrior has, but Prot Warrior is pulling ahead, and this is generally towards the fact that they are tankier than Prot Paladin, more so than doing more damage, which they still do, but it's not the main focus of the goodness of Prot Warrior right now. Now, the other thing we were wondering about was the growth of Resto Druid over Resto Shaman. We were looking at the weekly progression of popularity, and we were mentioning that Resto Shaman seemed to have peaked at 66%. By the second week of the season, they were at 66, and then the third week it was 66, and then the fourth week it was 66, and then the week after that it was at 62. So we were saying this is a bit worrying for the most popular spec if they plateau, if they stop already 4 weeks in and they stop growing. If you look at Frost DK, for example, that's how the most popular DPS spec is supposed to look like. They just grow every season until they get to very high numbers. So the week after that, after having gone to 62, there was the full crash out. Last reset, Resto stopped at 52%. And of course, the one who grew by almost 10% was Resto Druid, who now went up to 42%. Very close to matching the Resto Shaman. You can already see it when it comes to the higher level keys in Mythic Plus, that the split between Resto Shaman and Resto Druid does look somewhat close to being a 50-50, right? It does look pretty even between the two colors. As we scroll through all of the top level, in this case basically all of the plus 20 keys, it does seem pretty even. Resto is growing as the key go higher in keys, not to the same obvious level of Protection Warrior, but they do go from 29% to 37 and even 39%. So it is still a significant growth compared to 16 level keys. And again, we don't count this one because it's just six healers for now in 21 keys, but they are definitely growing when it gets to higher level keys. Now, the debate between these two healers is the same debate we asked ourselves when we saw Resto Shaman being popular a few weeks in this season. Resto Shaman, as the keys get higher and higher, you will have two problems: staying alive, being able to essentially group heal very hard damage events, or number two, keep individual players alive. And we pointed out that when it came to keeping individual players alive, Discipline Priest was the best healer in the meta. And when it came to group healing, constant group healing, very effortless group healing, Resto Druid was the strongest one in the meta. So Resto Shaman, as keys went higher, would have likely suffered more against one of these two specs. And right now, it does seem like Resto Druid is growing more compared to Resto Shaman. Now, Resto Druid also does bring the Mark of the Wild, which is 3% more damage for everyone, 1.5% damage reduction. Resto Shaman has the Mastery buff, which is okay. It's very good for Frost DK, the mainstay DPS member of the group, but not great for the other two DPS spec in your group. Resto Shaman itself is quite the squishy spec. Resto Shaman itself also still suffer from the weakness of not really having an external to save players with, which remains a pretty clear weakness in higher Mythic Plus level keys. So it is somewhat understandable to see this more reliance on playing Resto Druid over playing Resto Shaman as we go deeper down in key levels. That being said though, we have been repeating this for quite a few weeks now, so the more this continue happening, the better it is. We are now in a tier where at the moment we still have the better level, I guess the better kind of balance between specs, I guess the meta between specs. It is more reminiscent to the days of Dragonflight, because if you look at our last couple of seasons, right, 5 to 6 weeks in was the moment essentially where Disc took over and became the super popular healer. That was also the same, more or less the same time where Prot Paladin took over and became the only option for tanks. It took even less in Season 2 to find out Vengeance and Disc were the best comp. And then back in the last season of Dragonflight, it was pretty much from the get-go, just Resto Druid and Vengeance. Meanwhile, the seasons before these were way more open. You know, it took something like 3 months before Vengeance got to this level, while the healers still remained pretty nicely split. In Season 2, it took a while before we found the Exodia comp. It was about 2 months. Up to then, it looked like it was pretty even and spread in terms of popularity between tank and healers. And Season 1 was even more balanced in terms of tanks and healers. Even in terms of DPS popularity, we're obviously not, again, at the level of these first season of Dragonflight, but also, to be fair, not to any Exodia level popularity. You know, this kind of numbers you would see plus 70% popularity for 3 different specs, something that we saw in Season 1, something that we saw in Season 2. These numbers now are more contained. They're not contained for Frost Decay. You know, it's inevitable, at least one spec will become the super meta one. But for Havoc and Arcane, they have the more popular numbers. They are the more popular specs in a comp, but, you know, not even breaking 50% in terms of popularity numbers is pretty decent for the popularity of the other specs that we mentioned seeing in some of the more popular groups often. So we're talking about specs making their way in these comps like Elemental, like BM, Destro, Ret, or Fury, right? These specs showing up more and more. You know, to put things in perspective, this is how Season 2 looked. And this is how Season 1 looked, right? So this means there is essentially one spec, almost 33, 1/3 of all comp you have ever saw in the higher level keys were this exact same comp. And then in Season 2 it got even worse, because it was 45% of all comps were exactly this comp right here. Meanwhile, now, even if you look at the top comp, it's barely breaking 10%. So at least for now, we still have slightly more variety, even though technically, if you add these 3 comps together, it makes up 30% and there is 0 change between the DPS. The only change is healers and tanks. The change in DPS happens later on. It is still better than what we have gotten in the first couple of seasons of this expansion. But at the end of this recap, we have to confirm the trend we have started monitoring last week. So Resto Druid has continued to grow over Resto Shaman, even though Resto Shaman is still ahead in overall popularity, even at high level keys. Who is not ahead after the trend has continued to grow for Prot Warrior is Prot Paladin. Now, even in higher level keys, the advantage of Prot Warrior is clear. Meanwhile, we're still continuing to monitor the heavy growth of BM Hunter, who has now passed the 2nd tier of best specs and is now fast, steadily approaching the 1st tier of best spec, even down to this very reset in this first few days of the reset, pretty much matching their popularity at the moment in high level keys. So this is what we have seen on this reset week 6 of Mythic Plus, as we just entered a couple of days of week 7. We will see a week from now how many things have changed. But for today, on this Friday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting Competitive for free, by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't like it when it's cloudy and cold, but it's not quite raining yet, because it means the flies are gonna try to get inside, and that's not good.